It's typical tech community for a company to release a phone for the masses, one that focuses its efforts on providing extreme value, and then for there to be a gargantuan divide between people and wars in the comment section. This is the story of the phone that broke the internet. But before that guys, I'm really trying to hit 100,000 subscribers, so if you wouldn't mind hitting that button, it would mean the absolute world to me. Thank you so much for your support. Do you remember this video? Jonathan Morrison set up a blind experiment between the iPhone XR and the Pocophone F1 with a demo video and had people vote which one had the better screen. This all started because the Pocophone F1, which launched at a fraction the cost of the iPhone XR, had a higher resolution display. And note that I said higher resolution and not better. This caused outrage and spec nerds worldwide rose up to laugh at the iPhone with its not even 1080p display for $700+. But as I'm sure you all know, specs aren't everything, and resolution certainly isn't. In this experiment, so many people voted the iPhone the better display, even those who were likely Poco proponents before the whole thing started. This video blew up and pretty much just stoked the fire. People were fuming at each other in the comments because of a smartphone, and I kid you not, there are still debates going on about this thing in forums and in comment sections worldwide to this day. In fact, I would guess that a year after I release this video, there's going to be at least one of those debates in this comment section. It's wild. Of course, the Poco F1 was no ordinary smartphone. Xiaomi made a device that pretty much focused on two things, and absolutely nothing else. It made a phone as affordable as possible, just shy of £350 here in the UK, or about half the aforementioned iPhone XR, that rocked the best SoC at the time, lots of RAM and storage, and a big battery. To some people, this was a dream phone because they didn't care about camera performance, software stability, or update support. They didn't care for nicely built phones, all of which wasted money when that could have been either used in other areas, or better yet, just shaved off the price entirely. The F1 was the result of this, and to be honest, it wasn't too bad a phone. I used it. I sold my iPhone X to use this phone back in the day. It did exactly what it set out to do. Plastic chassis, plastic back, thick bezels with a huge notch taken out the top. It felt pretty meh at the time, but it also delivered the Snapdragon 845 SoC, 6 or 8 gigs of RAM, with 64, 128 or 256 gigs of storage, with a 4000 mAh battery, for half the cost of other phones that had these specifications. It was the ultimate flagship killer, and you hear that phrase used all the time now, but this was one of those early phones that really went onto it, really sparked that trend. Arguably OnePlus did do it a little bit before, but that company was still using high quality build materials, and so it was never really quite as extreme as the Pocophone in terms of being a flagship killer. That display that caused heaps of controversy and outrage did so for a reason. This was proof that if anything else, specs don't always matter. Sure, it's wide full HD display, but its implementation of IPS meant that it cast awful shadows in the corners and around the edges compared to an OLED. It also had really poor pixel refresh times and straight up bad viewing angles. It was a pretty weak screen, which was hilarious because all the nerds in the comments of the videos were screaming resolution, when at this size, the iPhone's display was just better, even though it was not sharper. And though the headphone port and microSD card slot were being removed from a few phones at this time, namely from the iPhone, the Poco F1 stuck with it because it added value, and I can totally see why people wanted a phone like this. It was a people's phone, not a fashion statement, not a sign of wealth, but a functional and complete device for many people. Fun fact actually, and this is neither fun nor a fact, but in my opinion, the F1 is actually built nicer than the Pixel 8a, whose plastic back almost feels hollow, and the phone itself just kind of feels like a toy. The F1 feels denser, it feels stronger, like it's going to withstand a drop or a collision with fewer dramas, which is quite interesting because there's no IP rating or mil-spec certification, so it's kind of on you if you drop it in a pool or get stuck out in the rain with it. But it does feel pretty solid, and my unit has held up remarkably well. But the F1, yeah, it's niche. I knew 0 people in real life who had one of these things, even though they were available here in the UK on launch. These phones were made for a specific group of people, and so there were, to some people, understandable compromises. such as in the camera performance, that other companies had actually been going the opposite way and trying to focus their efforts on improving instead of this phone. This was never an insane camera, and it certainly feels its age now, specifically with a relatively small sensor and complete lack of optical image stabilization. It's not the worst camera in the world, especially in decent light, but its lack of high-end dynamic range and its issues in low light are apparent and would certainly put a fair few people off, given that cameras are statistically one of the most sought after things in smartphones. Can you use the Poco F1 in 2024? Well yeah, of course you can. It's not a horrific phone by any stretch of the imagination. The performance is certainly not what it was, but you can still play more basic games, and browsing around and switching between apps isn't super jarring or laggy, which is nice considering this phone is now 6 years old. The one I have here is the base model. It's 6 gigs of RAM and 64 gigs of storage, which does feel pretty dated now, but there are of course better options you can buy, and they're also really cheap on eBay if you want one and want to try it out. My model probably needs a new battery, to be honest, but aside from that, you can very much get the basics done on this thing, and it's one of the most popular phones out there for custom ROMing, so there are heaps of different ways of getting Android 14 on this thing, despite the last official update being Android 10, and the launch version being Android 8.1 way back in 2018. And you'll probably want to get a fresh ROM on this thing if you can, because the official Android 10 build on here will and does run into compatibility issues with some apps and security issues with others. I don't recommend the average person picking up a Poco F1 if they want to use the stock old software on it. It's just not that good these days, and like I said, there are plenty of other options. The Pocophone community is really strong. On Reddit it has almost 100,000 members, which is pretty substantial, and there are heaps of people still engaging in and with the Poco community, affectionately known as Poco Bros, if you know you know. And the F1 is held up as one of those great pioneers and innovators for the whole flagship killer niche as a whole. You'll notice that if you peruse r/Pocophones or witness any kind of Pocophone discussion anywhere online, there seems to be a massive focus on specs and performance, at getting the most out of the chipset and really pushing these devices to be as fast as possible, despite the fact that in a lot of cases they don't start off as the best SoCs in class anyway. What's the Poco brand up to now? Well, sort of doing the same thing, I guess, except with more funky designs and non-Qualcomm chipsets in some cases, which means that the newer models are quite the departure from what the F1 did back in the day. It's certainly not the same concept as the original. The Poco brand seems to have sort of spent its time in the Western limelight and is now focusing heavily on the East, with India being a particularly strong market for the Poco fork of Xiaomi. The Pocophone F1 is a really fascinating phone because it catered to a very specific audience, namely performance enthusiasts and those who didn't want to or have the ability to spend heaps on a top shelf model, but really wanted that level of speed and battery life. This phone was made for the Poco Bros, and they loved this thing. To a chunk of people, this is the best phone ever made. This, the Pocophone F1, is the most surprisingly controversial phone of all time, and I can't believe that it broke the internet.